Hello and welcome once again. When I first started teaching poetry at the Care Center, a school for teen moms who'd dropped out of high school, I believed what Pablo Neruda said about poetry, that it's like bread and it should be shared by all. And I believed what poet and activist Audre Lorde said, that poetry is not a luxury. But then, I came to school for my first day, armed with my Virginia Woolf tote bag, overflowing with poems by Shakespeare and Whitman and Rossetti and Dickinson and Frost. And I found out that my students, who were teen moms, mostly facing poverty, neighborhood violence, gangs living on their block, that they, in fact, believed that poetry was a luxury, and one that they didn't necessarily have time for. Some of my students, when I met them, they were trying to deal with issues like how they were going to move out of the shelter and find an apartment of their own, or how they were going to pay the rent while their boyfriend was maybe in jail, or how to get a driver's license so they could get and keep a good job. And I stood up before them and asked questions like, "What is poetry?" And they looked back at me, silent. And the seconds would slink past, and maybe one of my students would look at me with her heavily mascaraed eyes and her done-up nails with the blue and silver polish, and she'd say, "I think it's supposed to rhyme." And another student would say, "It's boring. We learned that in middle school." But none of them could tell me the name of a poet or a favorite poem. None had ever written a poem or showed any sign of wanting to write one just then. I think any sane person might have been discouraged at this point, but I wasn't. I came back day after day, and little by little, I started to see signs, like those little flowers we see when we're waiting for spring, the slightest little buds. One of my first signs was a student named Ruth, who would sit slumped in her chair in the back of the room. And when she did write, she wrote in such teeny cursive that I had to put reading glasses on top of my reading glasses just to see it. But little by little, over time, I saw that handwriting start to grow into a big, bold cursive as she started to write her poems. And then another student would come to me and say that she was starting to keep a journal now at home. And another one came to me and asked if during her lunch break she could sit with me and start to write her own autobiography. And another one, as she was rushing off to pick up her sick child from the daycare, would say to me that the night before she'd found time to write a poem. And then I started to think, maybe there was something to this. Maybe there was something to what Audre Lorde said. True, poetry wasn't going to put food on their tables, and poetry wasn't going to make their lovers stick around. But maybe, just maybe, poetry could do something else. Poet Shirley Lin Lim has said that poetry saved her, that it was the force throughout her life that centered her. And I started to see that it was true for my students and myself as well, that maybe poetry could save some part of ourselves, right? Some part of our spirit, some part of our soul. So, how do we get there? How do we get from the resistance and the refusal that my students show me when I first walk in the room to writing poems that have meaning, that can save us, that become essential parts of our lives. Well, I've been doing this now for 15 years, and in that time I've learned some lessons, and I want to share 3 of them with you today. So the first one is, poetry really can be intimidating. So, we just don't call it poetry. We'll call it something else. The second lesson is that writing poetry really can be scary. So, we get scared and we do it anyway. Because the truth of the matter is that not writing our poems, not expressing what's inside of us is even scarier. And the third lesson is that silence is not a luxury either. And that's one of the things we need to write our poems. So, the first lesson, just don't call it poetry. In those early days of teaching at the Care Center, I had a student come into my classroom, late, by the way, and her name was Helena, and she'd been a basketball player. So the first thing I noticed about her when she strode into the room was that she was big. And then when she slammed her hand down on my desk and said, "I don't write poetry," I was a little intimidated. And I had the eyes of 15 or so other students on me. So I looked up to her and I said, "Okay, don't write a poem. Just have a seat, write something." And it worked. Because maybe it wasn't that day, maybe it was the next, but Helena did write something. I'm going to call it a poem. And when she read this to us about her experience growing up in the foster care system, we were all in tears. So what I've learned is we don't need to call it poetry, and I say it over and over again to my students who in more or less dramatic ways tell me that they just won't, don't, can't, will never write a poem. Okay, just write me something. Write a list, write what you're thinking, write what you had for breakfast. Just write anything, but that's okay, don't call it poetry. Which is an odd thing for a poetry teacher to say, because the truth of the matter is I want them to write poetry. I want them to love poetry. I want them to read poetry. I want them to live poetry, to find it in their neighborhoods, in their everyday life. The beautiful, magical, transcendent spirit of the poem. So, I like to quote poet Gwendolyn Brooks, Pulitzer Prize winner, who I was lucky enough to hear read down the road at Smith College just a few months before she died. And that evening she said, "Poetry is telling my particular truth the way I see it." So that's what my students and I do. We write our truths, one at a time, take some paper, some pens, 20 minutes, a little encouragement, and in that time we come up with writing, okay, I'm going to call it poetry, that's natural, heartfelt, moving, and inspirational. So my next lesson is that we need to get quiet, that silence is important too. But if I thought that it was challenging to get my students to buy into the idea that writing poetry mattered, getting them to buy into the idea that quiet mattered was even harder. My students come into class talking, laughing, shouting, dissing, gossiping. They're not a quiet bunch. They have earbuds in. Maybe they have a phone in their hand. But it's my job to get them quiet enough so that we can write. And what ends up happening is I have to shush them. And I've noticed They don't like being shushed. I've come to realize over time that quiet can be a haughty concept imposed by dominant cultures on others, right? So my students come from neighborhoods where if you want to talk to somebody, you open up the third floor window of your apartment and you shout down to the sidewalk and you have your conversation that way, right? Or they come from neighborhoods where there's music blaring from car stereo speakers and music's in the apartment. Music's in the air, it's in their ears, okay? And I'm always trying to get them to be quiet. Because we need quiet to write poetry. Poetry comes from the quiet places deep inside of us. And one thing I've noticed is that this issue with quiet, it's not particular to one neighborhood or one group of people. It's a diminishing resource in our culture in general. But I've also noticed that it's often reserved for the elite. So I've had to find ways to teach quiet. So sometimes my students and I will write by candlelight with Baroque music playing. Or I'll set a timer and encourage them to speak wholeheartedly to one another and to listen wholeheartedly for 2 minutes, then 3 minutes, then 4 minutes at a time. Learning to get quiet. And they say they've never experienced quiet just like that before and that they want to do it again. So I'll add to Audre Lorde's quote, poetry is not a luxury. And I will say that silence, the quiet from which our poetry springs, is not a luxury either. And we need to teach it to one another. We need to learn it. And the third lesson that I want to share with you is that poetry is, in fact, scary, and it's scary for a reason. Because in order to write our poems, we need to look into our own darkness. I had a poet, a student named, we'll call her Lysandra, and she would come to class day after day, and for whatever poetry prompt I would give her, she would more or less write the same thing. Her father had passed away and she missed him. And she wrote that again and again and again, just like that. And when she read those words out loud, she read them with no affect. She wasn't feeling anything. She didn't cry. She would just say those words. And when I would try to coax her or encourage her to say more, she'd clown around. She'd get defiant, she'd act up, she'd act out. Because it was scary to say more than that. But over time and with encouragement, I'd ask her to write about what she heard, what she saw, what she remembered when she thought about her dad. And little by little, she started to say more. She described a 23-year-old man with one gold tooth who used to wear a red baseball cap, who was shot in the back of the head when she was 8 years old. And when she read those poems, she cried, and we cried. But then she wrote more poems. She wrote more about her dad. She took some college classes. She's recently gotten a job. And she just keeps on writing about her dad and about other things too. She writes about everything. She's exploring her world. But what I've learned is my poets come to class not necessarily wanting words to be coaxed from them. They don't necessarily want to remember the neighborhood they woke up to that morning. They don't necessarily want to remember what it was like to lose a baby, an infant, to medical neglect, or to lose a dad to gang warfare. If I give what I think is an innocent writing prompt, tell me something about when you were 6 years old. Maybe for them, being 6 years old meant seeing their mom get beaten by their dad, right? They don't want to remember that right then. So I tell them, whatever's happened has happened. Right now, with pen in hand, with the paper in front of you and 20 minutes to write, you are the one in control. For these 20 minutes, you can start it, you can stop it, you can change it, you can tell it. It's your 20 minutes, and right now you have the power, you're in control. And this isn't something that's unique to my students. It's not unique to any one group of people, or neighborhood, or demographic. Every single one of us has darkness inside of us. We have those cobwebbed corners of our souls where we hide our repressed memories, our fears, our nightmares. And we all need to look into those places and express what we have, because if we don't, that silence turns into illness or violence or soul-numbing passivity. So in my class, we've learned that when we take our pen in hand, first the words come, then the tears come, then the breakthroughs come, and then we're on our way. So we move together from silence to poetry. And in our classes at the Care Center, we study great poets, and we become great poets. Each year, my students publish a journal of their poetry called Nautilus 2 that's been recognized by the Obama White House and awarded, and it's gained quite a bit of recognition around the country in newspapers like the Christian Science Monitor and the New York Times. And eventually, my students get to meet poets. Every year we bring Pulitzer Prize-winning poets. We've had Robert Pinsky and Sharon Olds. This is Alicia Ostreicher. So they get to meet accomplished poetic luminaries who've won awards and published beautiful books, and get their books signed and get their questions answered about how they can become poets or artists of any sort, express themselves. And we just keep doing it, day after day and year after year, proving what Audre Lorde has said, that poetry is not a luxury, it's essential. So we write together, we read together, and we celebrate. And I'd like to close by reading a poem by one of my students. This is a poem by Tzivia Gover, and it's called, If You Can Touch This Poem. If you can touch this poem, you can touch me. If you love this poem, you will love me. If you walk with this poem next to your heart, you will fill your heart with my blood. If you leave your memories behind when you read this poem, you will live my memories. If you go, keep walking and die with this poem by your side. You will make my heart die with this poem. I hope that now each of you will feel ready to teach, to write, and to be inspired by the essential and beautiful practice of poetry. Thank you.